Okay, good morning, freshmen. Today is Tuesday, May 12th. We are starting our second class on this new evolution unit. So in a moment, we'll recap things that we've done so far, what we've turned in, just so you guys are aware of, staying organized and being caught up. Students that have gotten behind, remember to send me an email anytime that you do submit something. So let's say you're taking the genetics test late or you're turning in the biotech video late. It's probably easiest, like for the biotech video, just email me the video. For the genetics assessment, take the assessment and then email it to me. Let's say you're missing the genetics packet still, just email that directly to me. That'll be the best way for me to get it into PowerSchool. So anyways, for today, we're going to start on the content of evolution, which is the first 15 slides of notes. This will be through a video, but I did post the evolution PowerPoint on Edmodo. So, like normal, you guys would do the notes for homework, and then I would come back the next day in class and recap it through lecture. So if you know that helped you, go ahead and jot down the notes from slides 1 through 15, and then come back and play the video, and you can basically listen to me going through your notes, and then jot down any questions that you have that you can deliver live on Thursday afternoon when we meet. Also, attached to this Edmodo post is a pretty big evolution packet. We're just going to do pages 1 and 2 of the packet today for homework, but I would print out that entire packet, staple it, and then that way you can have it and make sure that it's not getting lost, that it's staying in the staying in your binder, staying organized, so we can turn it all in at the end of the unit. But anyways, let's go ahead and get started. Like always, I hope you guys are safe. Hope you're doing okay. Hopefully, with the weather starting to warm up, you're able to maybe get outside safely. I've been reading more things about the COVID-19 virus, that being outdoors is one of the safest things. So, being on a bike and having a runner run by you from a few feet, it would be pretty rare to catch the virus that way. It's really weddings, funerals, birthday parties, sporting events. It's those like closed group for a long period of times. And thankfully, those are all still going to be banned in Michigan, at least for the foreseeable future. But anyways, let's go ahead and look at what we've done so far on the online learning. This is just a nice recap, and hopefully for the majority of you, you can just check off the list. You know you've done it all, and you're just staying on top of things. Okay, so starting with the genetics packet, that should be turned in on Edmodo. The genetics assessment should be completed. It's a Google form through Edmodo. And the biotech video also posted on Edmodo. If you're missing any three of these, I'm not really checking these on Edmodo anymore, so you would definitely have to send me an email with the genetics packet or the biotech video, or if you do the genetics assessment, send me an email saying that you completed the assessment. I can go in and look at the grade. Now the biotech chart should be completed and posted on Edmodo. There was a lot of students missing this. So I'm not sure if it wasn't clear that this was being turned in as an assignment or not. Anyways, I have not put this in gradebook yet because there's been a lot of missing. So just get this in today or tomorrow. Let's say by Wednesday, May 13th. That'll be like the due date. I'll put those grades in, and then anyone that does the biotech chart after Wednesday, just send me an email. Just send it directly to me so I can get that in. But if someone has it, a lot of you maybe did the chart and didn't realize you're supposed to turn it in on Edmodo. So just turn that in today or tomorrow. And then last Thursday, we started evolution with the geologic timeline. I did not collect that, so just keep that in your binder, and we'll submit that with the packet before the end of the semester, and so that'll be like our last big formative grade, our last big classwork assignment grade. So again, this is what we've done so far in terms of online learning. But let's go ahead. Hopefully, if you guys need to get caught up on either of these, today's a pretty light class, so maybe today would be a good day to get caught up on this. But otherwise, let's go ahead and get started with evolution. So go ahead and get out your notebooks. This is topic 8. This is our last topic of the semester. This is my favorite topic in biology. This topic really explains most of what we know in biology, whether it's central dogma from DNA to RNA to protein, whether it's the parts of the cell and how the cell gets energy, whether it's a chloroplast or mitochondria. All these aspects of biology have come about through evolution, and that's why I find it such a fascinating subject. So we're going to start with Darwin's voyage. You don't need to necessarily write down this, but just like Gregor Mendel was the first scientist to really understand the details of genetics, Darwin was the first scientist to, really figure out the theory of evolution by natural selection. And just so you guys know, the term theory in science means something that is so heavily agreed upon by scientists, it is unlikely to change in the future. Theories explain why, laws explain what. So I know some evolution, I'll say non-believers, they might say, well, if evolution is so sure, why would it be a theory and not a law? And it's because laws explain things like an equation, something that can clearly explain what something is, whereas theories explain why. Evolution explains why and how organisms change over time, and it's basically agreed upon by almost every scientist, so it's a very, very well supported theory. But anyways, before this theory was discovered, Darwin took a trip around the world on a boat called the HMS Beagle. This trip took 5 years. He left from Great Britain. He traveled south to South America. He stopped at the Galapagos Islands. This was his most famous stop. And then through across the Pacific, Indian Ocean, back to South America and back to Great Britain where he lived. And along this whole trip, he collected specimens. He collected plants and animals and insects and thousands and thousands of living things that he put on his boat and sailed around the world with. And it was the Galapagos Island where he made his most famous discoveries. So in the Galapagos Island, he found there was about 14 islands. These islands are all very new. They're volcanic islands. When I say new, I mean they're like a few million years old, where a lot of other bodies of land are hundreds of millions of years old or even billions of years old. And what he noticed about these islands and the species that lived on these islands were very interesting. He saw that they resemble the species of the South American mainland. And what he figured out from this is that species that lived in South America must have migrated over to the Galapagos Islands. But the animals and plants on the Galapagos Islands were not exactly the same as the animals and plants on South America. They were similar, but they were a little bit different. So he hypothesized, and again, he didn't come up with a theory on his own. He made a hypothesis, and then later scientists basically agreed upon and validated these hypotheses. That over time, the species must have changed based on the different environments of the islands. For example, on an island where there was really large seeds that you need a thick beak to crack, the birds, the finches on those islands, evolved to have a larger, thicker beak. On one island where it's very dry and there is cactuses or cacti, those finches developed a special beak to actually get insects out of the inside of the cactus. Now, the important thing is, and we'll get into this later, it's not that these finches just magically created these new traits. These traits were already, they were already within a population. They might have been rare or recessive traits, but specific traits that led to getting more food or surviving on their specific environment became more and more popular. Because those, a bird that had a beak that can get insects out of a cactus is likely to survive, reproduce, and then pass on that trait to the offspring. So then the offspring will be able to survive and reproduce. And then fast forward a million years and you see the specific beaks on this specific island are suited to get food out of a cactus. Again, these animals are seen nowhere else on the planet. They look very similar to birds and iguanas and tortoises that live in South America, but they're all a little bit different because over time they had evolved and become specialized to live in the Galapagos. As I mentioned, these islands are fairly new. Here's a photo of a brand new Galapagos island. An underwater volcano erupts. The molten lava hardens. And then over time, you end up getting soil slowly accumulating on the island. Maybe a bird flies by and drops a plant seed, and you start to get grasses and shrubs and trees. And then eventually you get the wildlife there as well. But depending on the specifics of this island, those animals might change, and those plants too might change slowly over time. Over time, a new island like this will mature into an older island like this. And the best example, again, Darwin studied hundreds of different organisms, but the finches were the best example. That the finches basically looked very, very similar to the finches in South America, except their beaks were all a little bit different. And so he theorized that they must have migrated hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years ago, and then over time evolved to reach their specific environment. So here's that common ancestor from South America based on the different environments. So whether there's seeds available on an island, or insects, or maybe cacti, we see different adaptive radiation, different speciation, and we'll learn these terms in a bit, of these different organisms. I want to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 species of Galapagos finches. And I believe there's 14 islands, so it makes sense that each island had a slightly different environment. Those finches evolved to match that environment. Now, did Darwin actually see this happen? Did Darwin see a large beak shrink over time so it could eat small, so the bird could eat small seeds? Or did Darwin see a medium-sized beak become more pointy so it can catch insects in the air? No, he did not see all this, but he was able to basically piece it together like a detective that through evolution, through this adaptive radiation, different islands that had different food sources, we saw different evolutionary pressures, and we saw different types of beaks evolve to meet these pressures. Because if a finch had a beak made for eating grubs, but it lived on an island where there was fruit and no grubs, then that species would not survive. If a finch had a beak made for leaves, but it was on an island that had a lot of insects, it would not survive. And so there was probably lots of trial and error of some finches basically through natural variation, through normal genetic differences. Like normally if I was in the classroom now, I would point out to you that we're all a little bit different. Some of us tall, some of us short, some of us curly hair, some of us straight hair. And these finches are the exact same, but the ones that had the beak that was less fit for survival would end up dying out over time. The ones that had the beak that were better suited for finding food, they would more likely survive. And then most importantly, they would most likely reproduce, pass on those similar traits. And then that's how you see 14 different islands and 14 different species of finches that basically evolved over that time. Now again, if you're a little lost right now, that's okay, but I think this is a good way to sort of think of, just how this all takes place, how this slow process takes place. And it's seen all over the place. It's seen on every continent on the planet, except because the Galapagos Islands are a small almost controlled environment, 14 fairly new islands that started with 14 similar species, or one similar species coming over from South America. We're able to see this sort of like a controlled laboratory experiment. But of course, this has happened all over the planet. So when Darwin got back from this trip and kind of pieced it all together, he published it's probably the most famous, probably still the most famous book, science book ever written, 1859. He called it The Origin of Species, and it basically explains how evolution occurs through the process of natural selection. Evolution being the result of new species, of change in species. Natural selection being the process of, you know, organism A has a trait, organism B does not have that trait, organism A is more likely to survive, reproduce, pass on those traits. This organism's less likely to, and natural selection is sort of the process of how this all occurs. It explains both life's unity, the fact that we all came from this common ancestor that evolved the use of DNA to RNA to protein. We all reproduce in a fairly similar way, whether it's meiosis if you're a sexual species, or mitosis if you're an asexual species. But also explains the diversity of life, how we have millions and millions of different species today because of this process. And as I mentioned, natural selection being the cause of evolution, the result. So now this is the first thing I want you to really write down. I'd say this is the most important thing from this evolution topic, and it's these 4 steps of evolution. Again, Darwin wrote a 300-page book about it. I've read it. It's pretty slow. I find it pretty boring. But everything that Darwin figured out, everything he discovered, we're going to try to simplify it down to VHOR, a 4-step process. Step 1, you got to have variation. Organisms are individually unique from each other. Some of these traits may be advantageous, some might be disadvantageous. Again, we learned this in our DNA and genetics unit, that all living things have variation. I remember telling you a couple times that genetic variation is good, and we didn't really go into why, but here's the why. In order for evolution to occur, you gotta have variation. If every human being looked and acted and was the exact same, there'd be no opportunity to evolve as a species. Number 2, heritability. This one's pretty obvious. Variation gets passed on to offspring. I'm tall, therefore my offspring probably have a better chance of being tall. If I have, I think my eyes are pretty good, I have good vision, therefore my offspring have a better chance of having good vision. But then I also, I have anxiety. I get nervous about things, and that might be a behavioral trait that my offspring are more likely to have. So again, whatever the trait is, we know from previous units that it is heritable, it gets passed on. Now, here's where we need to understand that not all offspring survive. And this is hard to understand in human terms because we pretty much all survive. But thinking about in the wild, overproduction of offspring. Because there's not an infinite amount of food and resources, only the strongest offspring survive. If I have 10 kids and I only have enough food and money and resources for 7 of those kids to survive. I know this seems a little dire. Maybe I should have used a different example. Let's talk about squirrels. A squirrel has 10 squirrel babies, but there's only enough acorns to give to 6 of those squirrel babies. It's probably going to be the ones that have the best traits, the ones that are able to maybe find some food on their own, the ones that are able to interact with their squirrel peers. But realize that not all offspring survive. So going back to step 1, it's the ones that had the variety of good traits, traits that are more likely to lead to survival. Those are the ones more likely to survive. And then those that survive are going to have a reproductive advantage as well, because when they reproduce, again, they're more likely to reproduce, and when they do reproduce, they're likely going to pass on those traits that gave them the advantage in the first place. So you're going to see in the packet, in our assignment on Thursday too, that everything's going to kind of come back to these 4 steps. So in terms of understanding this unit, this is it. If you have questions, write them down now, and we can discuss and go over them in more detail Thursday at 3 p.m. But if these 4 steps make sense to you, then basically Darwin's voyage and what he discovered, this is basically it. All right, so a little test of, can you explain that situation of VHOR? Can you explain this to a 5th grader? And think about the idea of variation, heredity, overproduction of offspring, reproductive advantage. Take a minute, pause the video, see if you can explain what's going on here. So what I see is step 1, there's variation. We see these different beetles. Some are dark brown, some are light brown. There's a bunch of different colors. Step 2, realize that environments change over time. And so there's a river here that didn't used to be here. Think about what planet Earth looked like a billion years ago. Environments are different. Environments change over time. And what that means is that certain traits, certain variation may give a reproductive advantage over time. So you're having an overproduction of offspring. These beetles are having lots of babies. These beetles are having lots of babies. The environment changes over time. It looks like this environment up top may be something like a forest, and then this environment down below might be something like a desert, and then that reproductive advantage turns out to be the variation in color. The offspring that were brown in this top environment were less likely to reproduce, less likely to pass on their traits. The ones that were greener were more likely to reproduce and pass on their traits. Down here, the ones that were green did not have a reproductive advantage. The ones that were tan, the ones that were light brown, were more likely to reproduce and pass on those traits. And then what we see here is maybe this environment changes again, the riverbed dries up, we now have 2 species. So what we just saw is speciation, the formation of 2 unique species through evolution by natural selection. Speciation. That's a term we'll define in a second. And as we wrap up today's notes, there is some vocab that you need to know. I've used a lot of these terms, so I think you should be able to use context clues for them. But these first 2, obviously the big ones, natural selection and evolution. I think one of the biggest or smartest ways to think of this is that natural selection is the process and evolution is the result. So natural selection is when the environment favors certain traits and selects them, allowing for those that have those traits to survive and pass them on. Remember, traits can be both physical and behavioral. Selection pressure is often the environmental factor causing that struggle for survival. And so we often talk about selection pressures, and it's just what is happening in the environment, whether it's predator or prey or climate, that's causing one trait to be better than another. Whereas evolution is that result, the overall change over time. Adaptation, any trait that allows an individual or group a better chance at surviving and reproducing. So with humans, we talk about our opposable thumbs as a really unique adaptation. No organisms outside of primates have opposable thumbs, and generally speaking, primates are successful in a big part because of our opposable thumbs, because we can make tools and use utensils. Obviously, our large brains would be another adaptations that humans have, and all living things, have adaptations. There's famous ones, like a cactus has an adaptation that it can go months without any water. A polar bear has an adaptation that it has really, really thick skin and thick fur, and it's white so it blends in. But obviously, all living thing, if any organism's alive, it means that it was thousands, millions of years of adaptations along the way to make it a successful species. Fitness might be a new term that you've never used before. It's the reproductive success of an organism. It has nothing to do with what you think of as fitness. It's not how many push-ups you can do, how fast you can run the mile. It's just how many offsprings have you left. For example, Mr. Jones has 3 kids. Mr. Lambden has 2 kids. I have 2 kids. Clearly, Mr. Jones has the highest fitness of the 3 of us because he has successfully passed on his traits 3 different times. Mr. Lambden and myself have only done it 2 times. You watching this lecture, you have 0 fitness. Evolutionarily, you are a failure. Sorry if that sounds rude, but you have not passed on your traits. You've not passed on any of your beneficial adaptations. So therefore, you don't have any evolutionary fitness. All right, and then lastly, micro and macro evolution. Again, context clues, small and large. Small changes that occur within a species is known as microevolution. But enough of those small changes might add up to a new species. It might end up in what's called radiation, where one species splits into 2, or it might just be the extinction of an old species and a creation of a new species. But when you get enough of those small changes that you get a new species, that is macroevolution or large evolution. And lastly, what is a species? It is a group of organisms that breed with each other and produce fertile offspring in the wild. If species are different, then they will not be able to reproduce. There's exceptions to this rule. Like I know you've all heard of a liger. A lion and a tiger can reproduce, but they're not the same species because they would never reproduce in the wild. Tigers live in India, lions live in Africa, so first of all, they would never run into each other, but also they would not be interested in reproducing. Ligers are made basically through artificial semination. But again, if two organisms are similar enough and do breed naturally in the wild, they're considered the same species. Last term, sorry, I lied, is a pretty obvious one. Resource, anything that an organisms need to survive or benefit from. So food is a resource, water is a resource. Evolutionarily speaking, you would consider a mate to be a resource. Shelter would be a resource. Anything that helps you stay alive and give you that chance for passing on your traits. Okay, that's it for notes. Your homework today is page 1 and 2 of the evolution packet that's attached. Again, I would just print out that entire packet. That way you can just go back and kind of work on it piece by piece. But that's it for today. Have a good beginning of the week, and I'll see you guys on Thursday. Okay, good morning. It is now Thursday, May 14th. I hope you're having a great week. Today's notes are pretty minimal. It's slides 16 through 22, just going through a couple misconceptions about evolution. The homework, though, is more substantial. It's page 3 through 7 of the evolution package. That's 5 pages, and it is a online activity. It comes from a group of activities known as PHET, P-H-E-T. You'll probably get more familiar with those next year in physics. I think they're fairly commonly used in physics. So the link is in the packet. You could just Google PHET natural selection, and it'll be the first thing that comes up. You do need to make sure that Flash Player is updated and not blocked on your computer to use it. But again, the online activity, I'm going to say, is going to take an hour, maybe a little more. So just be prepared for that. Really quick notes today, 5-10 minutes. But then our online activity, pages 3 through 7 of the packet, will take substantially more. And like always, I know I canceled it last week because we weren't learning anything new. We didn't have anything going on. But for today, there will be the optional check-in, 3 o'clock. Hopefully, when you took those notes last class, if you were confused or had questions, you starred something or highlighted so you can ask me later. Or if you just want to check in and get caught up or say hi for any reason, that's absolutely okay with me. Okay, so let's get out our evolution notes. We can title this 7 Evolution Misunderstandings or Misconceptions. And the first one is that natural selection does not produce perfection. It is limited by historical constraints. A good example of this is the fact that we as humans evolved from 4-legged animals. It's an advantage to be bipedal, to stand upright, because we can use our arms, we can travel long distances, but often knees and backs are the first thing to go, first thing that start to hurt as we get older, and that's because of the evolutionary constraint, the fact that our bodies were modified through natural selection from 4-legged creatures. Evolution doesn't make new traits, it only improves existing traits. Selection favors the most fit available phenotypes, but new alleles, new traits, they don't just show up on demand. And so, all the diversity of life that's on planet Earth right now is from pre-existing traits that were then directionally became the norm over years and years and thousands of generations of evolution. Adaptations are often compromises. So this is an interesting one. Cheetahs are a good example. They're incredibly fast organisms, fastest land animal on Earth, but they break their bones a lot. And so there's this in between where if cheetahs had shorter legs, they would be less likely to break a leg, but they wouldn't be able to catch gazelles and they wouldn't be able to survive and reproduce. Now, if cheetahs had even longer legs, they might be even faster, but they get hurt all the time and wouldn't be able to survive and reproduce. So over generations and generations, cheetahs have evolved to have a long enough leg to catch prey, not so long that they always get hurt, but it's an interesting compromise. Flippers on seals make them very efficient on the water, but very inefficient on land. If you ever see a seal swimming, it's graceful, it's beautiful, it's really aerodynamic. If you see a seal on land, it makes you think, well, how could this species have evolved like this? But again, it's the compromise of being swift in the water, but being very awkward on land. Primates, we have full range of motion of our arms and our legs, which is great for making tools, for climbing through trees, but we sprain and tear and get injured more than other creatures do because of that dexterity. Luck plays a really big role in evolution. A lot of existing traits in all sorts of organisms are not because of natural selection, but because of chance. A couple examples in humans. Our esophagus and our trachea are right next to each other. And if you put food or water down the wrong one, you can choke and die. Obviously, that's not a beneficial trait, but there's never been the extreme selection pressure for that trait to be removed. Our ulnar nerve, which you guys know as your funny bone, a nerve that runs on the outside of our bones. There's no benefit for it to be there. It's basically a mistake that it's there, but it's not a big enough mistake that it makes us less likely to survive and reproduce. So it's just by chance we have this nerve on the outside of our bone that really hurts when we hit it. Number 5, individuals don't evolve, populations do. This is an important one. A lot of students I know on quizzes and tests get this one mixed up. It's not that an organism can develop a trait over time. So for example, giraffes trying to, obviously a giraffe with a longer neck can reach more leaves and has a better chance to survive. So it's not that a short-necked giraffe can evolve and stretch its neck to be longer. even though it might look that way, because over time giraffes' necks have gotten longer. Um, but it's not that the individuals evolve, it's that the giraffes that happen to have the trait to have the slightly longer neck are more likely to survive, more likely to then reproduce and pass on that trait. And then they have a baby giraffe that has a long neck. Um, Two giraffes get together that have long necks. They both found a lot of food because they could get to the top of the trees. They reproduce. Long neck and long neck, you might get a baby that has an even longer neck. And so over time, the giraffes' necks are getting longer, but it's the population, generation by generation. It's not the individual. Evolution is random. It's not intentional. It's not purposeful. It's based on luck. It's based on situation. It's based on the fact that environments change. There is no guiding purpose behind it. And as I just mentioned, evolution is situational. Environments vary and change. Evolution can happen quickly and slowly based on different environments. Some traits that are good now, like polar bears having really thick fur and blending in on the ice, that might not be a good trait in 100 years because there might not be a lot of snow or ice left in the Arctic to blend in. Having really thick fur might mean that polar bears are overheating because the Arctic is not so cold anymore. And so realize that over time, traits that used to be beneficial may be deleterious or disadvantageous, and vice versa. Okay, that's it for today's notes. Pretty minimal, as I mentioned, but please realize that the homework today is more extensive. Again, you can just Google PhET natural selection and you can get to the website, or you can just click the link from the attached packet. But you're doing 5 pages of that packet. You're not turning anything in yet. You're going to hold on to that stuff until the end of this unit, and then we'll do kind of a big virtual binder check. Okay, so that's it for this week. If you're caught up, everything makes sense, wonderful. I'll see you next Tuesday. If you do have questions, if you need to check in and go over a few things, I'll see you today, Thursday at 3 p.m. on Skype. See ya.